Hello, class. Welcome to our ethos lesson. Ethos, whatever. Ethos, page 46. Arguments based on character. Ethos, okay? Another way to think about ethos, as we saw, we can think about these as ethical arguments, okay? We're going to think about that, and this is kind of arguments or appeals to character, okay? Let's think about this, right? So I want to start off about this idea of, or what I want to start off with here is this idea of skepticism and reasonable doubt. Okay, one of the big elements of critical thinking is skepticism. Most definitely, taking information and questioning where that information is coming. That's really the crux of not only this chapter, but the crux of critical thinking is just that. Okay, character, two C's: character, credibility. Okay, you can take a look at, and like I said, this is not just a kind of left-leaning, right-leaning text, which I think is cool. But look at this kind of Fox News, what they say here about Fox News, right? These questions here in the early chapter on page 46. Whenever you read anything, whether it's a news article, an advertisement, a speech, or a tweet, you no doubt subconsciously analyze the message for a sense of the character and credibility of the sender. Those are the two C words, right? Perfect. Words I want us to really focus in on here. Okay, is this someone I know and trust? Does the Fox News reporter or the Doctors Without Borders website seem biased? Another keyword there, bias, okay? And if so, why? Why should I believe an advertisement for a car? Is this scholar really authority on the subject? Okay. Our culture teaches us to be skeptical of most messages, especially those that bombard us with slogans. Advertisement is a perfect example of this, right? You can understand you hear the term sex sells. Sometimes we're bombarded with these imagery. Violence sells, right? Humor sells. We talked about a little bit of humor in our last Ethos lesson, okay? So you can really think about these ideas here. How, in essence, are we kind of being fed fed any information really? How then do we as critical thinkers come back and test that information, right? And in essence, just like I said, we're not just about digesting the information, we're also how we present information as academics and as scholars, okay? Let's think about this idea here, right? I want to go down to thinking about, I want to jump ahead a little bit, okay? And I want to look at the bottom of 47, right? And it's really interesting. I'm like, wow, I don't know where they're taking this, but this argument, okay, about ethos and how Pope Francis gained almost his credibility with people, right? Immediately, and this was Pope Francis, and even if you're not religious, you can understand that he was really respected early on and kind of controversial, just for the simple fact that he was not someone that held on to previously stated beliefs by some popes. Okay, I'll leave it at that. But he says here, we can look in the middle of the page here, right? Following the abdication of Benedict, is that 16? Yes. A man many found scholarly, cold, and out of touch with the modern world. James Carroll, writing for the New Yorker, identifies a precise moment when the world realized, that it was dealing with a new sort of pope. Who am I to judge? With those 5 words, spoken in late July 2013 in reply to a reporter's question about the status of gay priests in the church, Pope Francis stepped away from the disapproving tone, the explicit moralizing typical of popes and bishops. This was a whole new era, right? Carroll goes on to explain that Francis quickly established his ethos. This is important. Just like I had you read that Ghost of Tsunami, take a look at this here and really challenge yourself and ask, how does the Pope establish ethos here? Here it is. With a series of specific actions, decisions, and moments of identification with ordinary people, marking him as someone even non-believers might listen to and respect. And this has been the, not critique, some people do critique this, but this has been like kind of his popularity, I feel, and even if you don't follow the Catholic Church or have reservations against it, that's besides the point. I want you to think about the Pope Francis here, right, as being someone who definitely is seen differently and how he established an ethos by his actions, right? I'm not going to read that whole passage there, okay? But you can understand here, and let's just read this last sentence, right? Francis says, I'm at the bottom of 47. My choices, including those related to the day-to-day aspects of life, like the use of a modest car, are related to a spiritual discernment that responds to a need that arises from looking at things, at people, and from reading the signs of the times. Okay, he's building his ethos here, right? In that last sentence, and there's a cool picture of him taking a selfie with a group of fans. At 48, right, or Wi-Fi, I guess. In the last sentence, Francis acknowledges that ethos is gained in part through identification with one's audience and era. Super, super important, right? You can see this and I hate to return to politics, but even in any, I don't care, sports or whatever, right? That's maybe a little confusing, but you can understand that it's almost like I call it like understanding the room, right? Who am I playing to? That's important, right? Say, for example, gay marriage, which we'll talk about a little bit, whether your feelings on that are one way or the other, you can understand that if you were for or against gay marriage, in our current climate, we're kind of, obviously with the legalization of gay marriage, we've moved to the different side, right? 60 years ago, 50 years ago, 20 years ago, right? You can understand that it was a lot different, okay? But playing to the ethos of your audience and the era also matters. That's how you establish a credibility with the people you're trying to muster, right? It's very important here. The fact that they use Pope Francis is really interesting to me, because he is a definite kind of controversial figure, but also he's new age in a sense, where I think he understood his audience and his era, right? Not agreeing with his politics, not making it about that. I am, because personally, and I'll be honest with you, I'm not a religious person. I was raised Catholic, but I can understand Pope Francis in the scope of critical thinking, right? And in this class, we're going to do a lot of that. Las Meninas is a perfect example. Not normally, I mean, you can understand. We're going to talk about that. I'm going to have a little bit of a lesson, or we have discussed, or we'll be looking at a video and a little mini lesson on that, right? But I also want you to think about how using Pope Francis, Las Meninas, and this is what we're going to do for our essay. The video we're about to watch, or may have watched, I don't know where I'm going to place this just yet, but thinking about how arguments are presented, do we then question how information is given to us? Okay, this is about ethos, character, and credibility. Do we question? Do we say? Do we have enough? Like in scholarly writing, that's what scholarly peer-reviewed journals are, in essence, character and credibility, because they're peer-reviewed, right? That's why there's a certain order of relevance. Not to get too off on a tangent, but now we're going to think about how things are presented to us, even artistically. How do you test an ethos of a piece? That's really interesting, right? Is there a credibility? Are they probably the prominent kind of scholars of the time? Okay, does that matter? Important questions. Okay. But let's move ahead here, not to get too off tangent, right? I want to think about this here, right? Oh, before I do that, before we move on. So I wrote here, ethos connects readers to arguments. This is the important thing, right? Important question I want to ask here. How do you as an academic, okay, as we think about this, as an academic writer, establish ethos? That's super important, okay? Obviously to textual evidence, but as we'll see here, being selective of who you use and if it's the correct audience, era, those matter when establishing an ethos, okay? On the bottom of page 48, right before the next section, I like these questions here, right? We observe, or what we say, what the authors are saying here, we observe people, groups, or institutions making and defending claims all the time, and inevitably ask ourselves, should we pay attention to them? Can we rely on them? Do we dare trust them? Consider, though, that the same questions will be asked about you and your work, especially in academic settings. That's what I was coming to. Okay, this is the question we're going to ask. You yourself are as a critical thinker, and you'll see I'll kind of be, repeating this a lot, and sorry if it seems repetitive, excuse me. But I feel you're going to go back and forth, testing the credibility, testing the ethos, pathos, logos of what's presented. Also maybe understanding how you use it. This one here, I don't want to say it's the most important in academia, because it's really not the most important in any aspect. But this is really key to academic writing, how you yourself establish character and credibility, okay? Especially before you are an expert in your field, say, okay? We're going to zoom through here because I'm already at 10 minutes because I talk so damn much. But let's go to the top of 49. Let's look at thinking critically about arguments based on character, okay? So put simply, arguments based on characters, I'm at the bottom of 48, ethos depends on trust, okay? And you may ask yourself, like, how do I establish trust with a reader, right? That's interesting. Like, or somebody I'm trying to convince. This is what ethos is about, okay? We tend to accept arguments from those we trust, and we trust them, whether individuals, groups, or institutions, in good part because of their reputations. Three main elements: credibility, authority, and unselfish or clear motives add up to ethos. If I were, and I want you to be annotating here and be selective, this is really important for me. And in my book, I have annotated specifically these three main elements: credibility, authority, and unselfish or clear motives. Those, in essence, are the makeup of what ethos stand by. Very important, okay? Let's look at these bullet points on the top of 49, okay? To answer serious, important questions, we often turn to professionals: doctors, lawyers, engineers, teachers. Shout out, hello. Pastors or to experts, those with knowledge and experience, for good advice. Based on their background, such people come with their ethos already established, okay? But even then, I want you to still question. Thus, appeals or arguments about character often turn on claims like these, okay? One, a person or group or institution is or not trustworthy or credible on this issue, okay? Second bullet point, a person or group or institution does or does not have the authority to speak to this issue. Questions you will all ask, okay? Third, a person or group or institution does or does not, have unselfish or clear motives for addressing this subject. This in essence, oh my goodness, I'm gonna have to start this whole video. This in essence is the makeup of how you test ethos, okay? Top of 49. Asking these questions is really key. If you can get a checkbox to these, then we have a ethos, right? And if we understand ethos as being what? Credibility, authority, unselfish or clear motives, this is it in a nutshell. How do you then return and ask those questions of what's being presented to you, okay? So you can test this, okay? Moving ahead, establishing trustworthiness and credibility, okay? I'm not going to touch too much on this. You can read that funny kind of J.K. Rowling excerpt, how she uses humor. Think about disarming. Also think about why we are taught to use a hook in our academic writing. You use a hook to, I would say, interest the reader, but also to disarm them a bit, especially if you have a contentious debate or a subject where you want them to listen to you, right? And sometimes they don't land. That's all good. But the a lot of people think, oh, it's just to interest them. I also feel like the hook is a form of disarmament, because a formal argument sometimes can get heated or sometimes be bland or dry. This is your way of like having your voice, okay? So I want you to think about, you have to think, and I wrote it here, have to think of academic writing connecting to core principles that are well established. This is the crux of establishing credibility at the academic level, okay? And that's also, in essence, how you we return to this idea of trust, right? The top of page 50, you can establish trustworthiness by connecting your own beliefs to core principles that are well established and widely respected. This strategy is particularly effective when your position seems to be, at first glance at least, a threat to traditional values, okay? There's some really good readings here regarding, Ruth J. Simmons says, for my part, I was cast as a troublemaker in my early career and accepted the disapproval that accompanies the expression of unpopular views. Okay, so we can think about the most heated debates in history. Slavery, obviously, right? There was a big contingent, there was a war for this. We can think about the civil rights movement, we can think about gay rights, which I've talked about. We could talk about abortion, okay? So there's a number of controversial topics that really align with this, okay? And the reason I'm bringing those up is, at first you need it and I want you to think about, now those seem like not as debatable, right? But they are. Some of them are coming back. But when these really seminal arguments or debates in history were fought, or when they were debated and they kind of changed, it begun with these types of arguments, okay? I love this quote here. It's fine to be a rebel when you're on the right side of history, because you hear that a lot, especially, and I've heard the left say this about the right now, thinking about like a detention camps, for example. They ask them, do you want to be on the right or the wrong side of history, right? So that's character and credibility, right? It may seem unpopular at a certain era and time, but down the road, maybe you're so invested in this idea of maybe, cultural, societal change that you don't give up on the character and the credibility you're trying to build, if that makes sense, right? So I want to move on here in the middle. Writers who establish their credibility seem trustworthy. So you have to establish that first before you have these big monumental changes, is what I'm trying to touch on, right? But sometimes to be credible, you have to admit limitations too. So it's not just kind of saying I'm the expert in any field. Also, this returns to this kind of humanizing argument where you may say, I don't know specifically 100% the topic, or I'm kind of lost on blah, blah, blah. Being honest is key as well, okay? Let's take a look at this here. You have to admit limitations too. The New York Times columnist Frank Bruni does is he positions himself in relation to issues of oppression and deep-seated bias in an editorial titled, I'm a White Man, Hear Me Out. First acknowledging his racial and socioeconomic privilege as a white man from an upper-class background, private school backyard swimming pool, Bruni then addressed another less privileged facet of his identity. But wait, I'm gay. Gay from a different, darker day, when gay stereotypes went unchallenged, gay jokes drew hearty laughter, and exponentially more Americans were closeted than out. The nade spread in our rallying cry, silence equals death, defined marginalization as well as any words could. Okay, so he made a concession here. He admitted it was a vulnerability, but he gave him a credibility to establish this idea that if he talks about marginalization, even though he's white and privileged, he was still marginalized because he was gay at this time. Not that that's a detriment, but for him, he's being raw with it and saying, you know what? I was treated this way. This gives me a credibility in this sphere. Okay. And that's really interesting. That's something to think about. Because then when you think about how credibility is established, this is one of the cruxes, or one of the most important facets of it, in my opinion, is having, an understanding that the person or the person making the argument knows where they're coming from. That's the easiest way I can put it, right? Quite often, you see, say for example, and this happens all the time in media, Twitter. Twitter is a great example, and I love Twitter for critical thinking. But you can say a white person or even a Latino commenting on African American experience, right? There may be some debate there and say, okay, where's your credibility in this sphere? That person then could probably come from a place of understanding, and it's not always simple. It's not this kind of puzzle pieces, etc. But or like the easy puzzle pieces. But at least here we understand that the credibility that's trying to be established is this. Bruni is arguing that I am marginalized even despite my white privilege. So that builds me a credibility to talk about marginalization. Okay. And that's something we'll sit with. Always, feel free to hit me up too with any questions. I might at the end of these lessons have a way for you to ask questions. I'm gonna set that up. If that works for you, let me know. Okay. Or you could just send me a message, right? So let's go to the top of page 1. In fact, whenever you write an essay or present an idea, you are sending signals about your credibility, whether you intend to or not. It's important. If your ideas are reasonable, your sources are reliable, and your language is appropriate to the project, you suggest to academic readers that you're someone whose ideas might deserve attention. Okay? All academic writing at its core is establishing this credibility. That's why we use outside sources. That's why we build on the shoulders of giants and use information that's been there before us. We engage in this academic conversation with an understanding that this will be there after us. Okay, so I want you to think about that. We're going to move kind of quickly here just because this is a really long video, way longer than I thought it was going to be. Okay, I'm just going to go over this at the bottom of page 51, claiming authority. Okay, I wrote here, and I'll probably just go off my notes here, and I want you to think about this here. I'm not going to go into the McCain. That's going to be way too long, but I want you to at least think about you're going to always question authority, right? So even if an established credibility is made, if there's character and credibility, that does not give free license to the person to not be questioned. Always question authority, okay? This is, in my opinion, the crux or the most important part of critical questioning, right? In essence, and what I want you to think about with ethos, about character and credibility, always be prepared in an academic setting and come from this point of view as an academic critical writer. Be prepared to then have your character and credibility tested. Do you have the receipts? Can you show me the proof? That is ultimately, that is the ultimate aspect of ethos, in my opinion. Okay, this is what we're learning it for. Like I said, I'm going to be repetitive. How is it used against me? Do I give them The benefit of ethos. Do they have character, credibility? Do they not? When I write, do I have character, credibility, authority? Okay. Or can I make a point for that? Okay. We're going to wrap up there with the ethos just because, like I said, this is longer than I intended, but it's all good. Hopefully that makes sense to you. We're going to go ahead and move on here to the next module. That will be logos. Okay. And then we'll be looking at our first essay prompt. Okay. Have a good one. I'll see you soon.